Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope that you enjoyed learning about film noir. And if you already didn't know about film noir, I hope that you can see how impactful the movement has been, and also just in regards to the assignment, how you can see how film noir aesthetics and tropes and archetypes and the femme fatale and whatnot are kind of everywhere and just a huge part of cinema and American culture in general. Moving right along chronologically, we are getting into um, the film Pather Panchali by Satyajit Ray from 1955. And now that we have a bit of an understanding of Italian neorealism and the neorealism movement and kind of that sort of low budget aesthetic that had been established in cinema, we are going to see so many more films that are branching off of that and that are deeply influenced by that movement to this day, really. But the impact globally with Italian neorealism was massive, and you just see examples from countries and cultures all over the world that are kind of following in the footsteps in some ways. And Pater Panchali is definitely a great example of the influence of Italian neorealism, especially because if you read, interviews and whatnot with Satyajit Ray, you will find out um, that he was very, very deeply influenced by bicycle thieves in particular, but the whole movement, which I'll give you an excerpt in a second. He basically just says that he went to a film festival and he saw bicycle thieves, and he was so inspired that he wrote the script for Pater Panchali on the train ride home. So um, I know that by today's standards, maybe bicycle thieves in some Italian neorealism films don't even feel that realistic. But for the time, they definitely were something different. In my opinion, Pater Panchali is sort of realism on steroids, and then of course several subsequent films. But if you were like, okay, well, this is realism. I mean, I guess like it still kind of feels like a scripted, commercial esque film, and I wouldn't say you're totally wrong. But when you see Pater Panchali, I think that you're really going to see like, okay, now I really feel like I'm just kind of witnessing life unfold like a fly on the wall or something like that. So I encourage you to reflect on day one when we talked about, or week one, I guess, when we talked about how to watch film and darkening the room and making sure you have good sound and turning off your phone and all those kinds of things. Because I think for a lot of people, they're going to find this movie challenging. It definitely tests your patience. I mean, just depending on sort of, I guess, your attention span. I mean, it does for me, even though I absolutely adore this movie. But it's the discipline required is worth it, and the reward is great. So this is an example of realism. It's an example of slow cinema, and believe me, there is much slower cinema out there. If you check out like Chantal Ackerman films, for example. But or another one comes to mind, Seitan Tango, which is like an 8 hour long movie. So those are like very amazing films in my opinion, and require some very advanced watching skills. But it's kind of like a meditation, I would say, in that it's not easy, but the reward is great. This is not like an insanely long movie at all, but it is what I think a lot of people would call slow. And just want to remind you that slow is not bad. Um, of course, it's subjective, but film doesn't always need to be very fast, as in has have a lot of causality in the narrative or a lot of fast editing, things like that. So I think this is going to be something different for a lot of you, not just due to like the aesthetic qualities and the fact that it's from 1955, but also the fact that it's in Bengali. Um, most people, I would say, have not been exposed to lots of movies coming from India. And obviously, just like every other country, there's a rich history um, of film and so many amazing movies from India. Um, so, and just South Asia, in general. But yeah, we don't get a lot of exposure out here in the U.S. to a lot of films from South Asia. So yeah, Satyajit Ray, he's prolific. He's made so many movies. So many of them are very critically acclaimed, very famous. Um, this one is probably his most. I mean, I would say definitely his most well known. But yeah, there are many more very critically acclaimed, and if you listen to interviews with the big names, like Scorsese or Tarantino or whoever, it's not uncommon that they're going to mention Satyajit Ray as being a big influence. This is considered one of the, like many of the movies I'm showing you, this is considered one of the best films of all time, according to like AFI and various BBC lists, things like that. You're gonna see this one on top 10 or top 20 pretty regularly, along with Bicycle Thieves, and yeah, and some other ones that we will see. Um, so I think it's a very important film. Um, Shot on film, 35 millimeter, naturally. Budgets more or less was 150,000 rupees, but $45,000 more or less. So low budget. It's Satyajit Ray's directorial debut, which is pretty amazing, I think, for a first feature film. I mean, if you watch most of your favorite directors' first feature films, if you can even find them, that's kind of inspiring because you're going to see they're generally very imperfect. And a lot of people like Tarantino, for example, will say like, yeah, I had no idea what I was doing. It's not great, but I learned a lot. So it's just like anything, you have to do it several times before you get it right. And for some reason, Satyajit Ray seemed to get it right first time around, and it's by many people's standards considered his best film. So it's based on a novel of the same name. I suppose maybe that helped a little bit with having some source material. And it was so successful that he didn't plan on it while he was making the movie, but because it was so big, he was able to make a sequel and then another sequel. So Aparajito in 1956 and Apur Sansar in 1959. Missing a parenthesis there. Um, and I've seen all three of them many times over. I think they're all amazing. It's really cool to see the story continue and then the main characters get older. So kind of like, Boyhood, I guess, if you've seen that film, only done, 60 years earlier. The score is by Ravi Shankar. You might know his name. There's a link there if you want to click on it. He is a classical Indian musician, who's just, yeah, a very very famous musician. I guess is all I can really say. Very prolific. Um, his whole family are musicians. Anushka Shankar, who's actually playing a concert. I've seen her live before. She's playing a concert at Stanford, I think, in a few weeks. And yeah, just this big family of musicians. Oh, Nora Jones is the niece, I believe, of Ravi Shankar. Either way, she's a Shankar also. Ravi Shankar collaborated with the Beatles when they got really into Eastern kind of psychedelic music. So all the sitar that you hear in Beatles songs is played by Ravi Shankar. So the Beatles really admired him. Um, this film, I don't know if it birthed it next necessarily, but it's considered by film critics and academics to be part of the parallel cinema movement, um, which we don't need to get into too much. I left a link in there for you, but it's sort of a uniquely South Asian or uniquely Indian version of Italian neorealism. So a lot of the similar traits that you would see in Italian neorealism, only in a completely different setting, right? Because we're not in Italy anymore. So different social issues um, and things like that. So yeah, it's a really really fascinating movement in film. And this is just a recurring pattern we're going to see all over the place with particular movements rippling across the world, and often too, I would say occurring simultaneously. So it's hard to know kind of what's first in many ways, but um, here is an excerpt from Satyajit Ray. It's a book actually, where I think he basically talks about like his process and reflections on filmmaking. I can't remember exactly, but this is the excerpt about him that I mentioned, talking about how he saw Bicycle Thieves. So read that on your own time, and then I have a link to the video essay. So, like I mentioned, parallel cinema and Pathar Panchali, deeply influenced by Italian realism. So, again, focus on realism, everyday life, use of non professional actors, on location shooting, depiction of poverty, humanism and compassion, themes of humanism and compassion, minimalist approach, children as central characters, which you're going to see in Pathar Panchali, and then also films about social issues, and in this case, ones that are, unique to this setting. If you enjoy Pathar Panchali and I think just want to explore films that kind of embrace the tradition of realism, of Italian neorealism, of parallel cinema, um, films that have very rich humanist themes. Um, Here's a list, just a list of recommendations. These are all very famous movies. You might recognize some of them. They aren't like all kind like in the same category really, but I think that these are kind of films that are basically like if you liked Pathar Panchali, you might like these. Um, so yeah, you can go down that rabbit hole. Personally, some of my favorites on here would be the 400 Blows. That's it. We're not going to watch it in this class, but it is a very famous movie, very influential. Again, another one of the movies that's frequently on top 10 best films of all time list. and then some Kurosawa from Japan, Fellini, other Satyajit Ray movies, Umberto D, which I already recommended. My other favorite, Vittorio De Sica, director of Bicycle Thieves movie. I might even like it more than Bicycle Thieves. I'm not sure. Antonioni, Ingmar Bergman, um, even some more contemporary examples such as Lars von Trier and David Lynch on here. Um, Kiarostami, who we're going to get into later. So, for those of you who are cinephiles or emerging cinephiles, here's a good list for you to check out. And yeah, I hope that Patar Panchali opens some doors um, to you to explore other films. So there's going to be an assignment about this on the screening. I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to move on, actually, a little bit of a pivot. We are going to get into aspect ratio. So the next several lectures are going to be all about cinematography. So getting a bit more into kind of production things. We've laid a foundation of acquainting ourselves with history, with genres, with notable filmmakers, things such as that. And now I kind of want to move us a bit more into like filmmaking. So your assignment this week is actually going to be to make a film. But don't be scared. It's not going to be requiring um, multiple shots and editing and scoring, and it's not like a proper film. It's really just want you to record something really simple and incorporate aspect ratio. So aspect ratio, it's a very interesting thing because it's one of those things that unless you're into film, or you've kind of learned about film, you may have never really noticed it or really paid attention to it or really thought about it. But movies and shows and video games, and pretty much all visual content, it's consumed in different aspect ratios, which we will get into exactly what that is in a second. So let me just start by saying what is an aspect ratio? It's the proportional relationship between the width and height of an image or screen. So it's expressed as two numbers, and you might have seen these before: 16 by 9, 2.39 by 1, or 4 by 3. So what these numbers mean is the first number represents the width and the second number represents the height. So generally in pixels, but it's just a proportional ratio. So you could kind of measure it in any way you want, really. But it's the width by the height. So some movies are shot kind of more square like, and some of them are shot more wide like. Um, and there are various, like almost infinite versions of this. There are a lot of standard ones, um, but it's a choice that people make depending on a lot of factors. When you experience AR aspect ratios, I'm just abbreviating it as ARs, it alludes to different eras and trends, and it can also provide historical context. So, for example, if you film something or if you watch something that's in a more square aspect ratio, it might automatically have a feeling of something more vintage, something kind of older, because the standard for a long time in cinema and still photography was these almost square, not perfectly square, but almost square like aspect ratios. And then the aspect ratio started to get a bit wider and wider, and now we're kind of in an era where it's shrinking to back down a little bit, um, kind of in general. But it yeah, it can provide a like an immediate historical context. But it's not just an aesthetic choice. the aspect ratio affects your perception. Um, it affects the way you capture things. So a more square aspect ratio is going to feature a lot of single shots. It may not feature a lot of double shots or two shots. Sorry, meaning it's harder to fit two people in the frame when your aspect ratio is more square. If you have a character that's very tall and very short, for example, that might be very challenging. So in Bicycle Thieves, because it's a man and a boy, if that movie was shot in like an ultra wide or just wide even aspect ratio, it might be very difficult to get both of their heads in frame. And that movie is shot in a more, I think, in the Academy ratio, so it's a more square aspect ratio. It's a lot easier to get the two of them in the frame. If you do a close up and you have a very wide aspect ratio, you're going to have a lot of empty space on either side of your character's head. And if you're in a more square aspect ratio, you'll have um, less emptiness on either side of the head. It also affects motion. So if you have a very wide screen, you might not have to move the camera as much, which can actually make things look very static, and that could be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, just depending on your intentions. But if you have a more square aspect ratio, you're often forced to move the camera a heck of a lot more, which is also why like the square aspect ratio of home video and 8mm and whatnot looks really jerky because you're kind of having to constantly move the camera to get the things that you want in the frame. So that works great for um, like found footage films or something where you just want to have a lot of movement. Um, Also, landscape, for example, if you want things to look really sprawling, No Country for Old Men or some sort of like sun-baked noir, films like that where they really use the landscape. Blade Runner, I guess, comes to mind, which is also a noir, but um, yeah, a square kind of framing is not really going to do that justice. But if you want your film to look really claustrophobic and you can't really see a lot of information around your subjects, then a more square aspect ratio might be the right choice. So it's not just a choice that people make for aesthetics or in regards to the narrative or in regards to sort of a historical context. It's also just straight up limited by camera technology and also distribution platforms. So, just also something to keep in mind. Your phones, for example, if you have an iPhone, you're limited to um, 1 to 1, 4 to 3, or 16 by 9. Although maybe some of the newer models have more aspect ratio options. I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I think Samsung and some other phones, they have more options for aspect ratio. And then very professional cameras might have many more or even customizable ones. So sometimes you kind of have no choice. Also, depending on where your film is going to live at the end, that might have their limitations on aspect ratio. So, here are a couple videos that are really helpful for seeing exactly what I'm talking about. If you're confused by the lecture so far, then once you watch these videos, it's going to make a heck of a lot more sense. It's hard to explain aspect ratio and how it affects movement and framing and whatnot without actually seeing that happen. So definitely check those out. Bonus viewing, I'm not requiring you to watch this one, but for those of you who are really into film or just want to kind of go a bit further, I think that the second video is really helpful. So, I definitely recommend checking that out. But for sure, watch the first one. Here um, are some diagrams of different aspect ratios. So, and kind of what technology they pertain to. So yeah, there's various ones here. 16 by 9 is widescreen. You've probably heard that term before. 1.85 by 1 is very common for a lot of films, especially these days. CinemaScope, not very common, but there's so many different versions. These are just some of the more popular ones. And then your phone, it's 9 by 16, which is actually an extremely unique aspect ratio, which, yeah, has never really been around, I would say, before, because people didn't really think to shoot things vertically. I mean, I don't think there are any movie examples in the past that are shot in a vertical aspect ratio, such as this. There are some now, though, actually. But of course, they're meant to look like they were filmed on a phone, like some found footage movies and things like that. So your phone is actually widescreen if you just turn it sideways. So it's 16 by 9 if you turn it sideways and 9 by 16 if you hold it upright. Um, Here is aspect ratios all kind of stacked on top of each other so you can sort of see how they look in comparison to each other. The bottom one is all them stacked on top of each other. The Polyvision one down there is extremely rare, but it does exist. And I guess really, I don't know if it does exist anymore. It's more of did exist because when Napoleon in like the 20s, I think, yeah, it says right there in the 20s, 27 was screened. It was designed to be shot, to be viewed on three different projectors side by side. So the end result is this like incredibly wide aspect ratio. It's sort of like a IMAX dome sort of, predecessor in a way, I guess. Um, so yeah, they're expressed sometimes in these decimals, and usually in a professional setting, that's kind of the more the way they're communicated, and it's also just a bit more specific rather than kind of rounding to the nearest whole number. So sometimes people will just say, "Oh, it's shot in 2.39 for short, or 1.85." That's generally what you're going to hear when cinematographers or professionals are talking about film. But just keep that in mind. What they're saying is it's 1.85 by 1, but they just say 1.85. Um, Here are some examples of aspect ratios in some films that you might know. So the Grand Budapest, I guess is how you say it, Hotel was shot in three different aspect ratios, which is really unique. You don't see aspect ratio change in movies very often. It does happen, but yeah, you're not going to see that very often. And this was done in order to sort of structure the film clearly. And so I can't remember the exact, actually, I think they talk about in the video, but each aspect ratio refers to a different time in history because the film takes place during three different eras. So each aspect ratio refers to a different era, and the most square one being the oldest. So, like I said in the beginning, is it can allude to different eras in history. So even though you may not even be noticing the aspect ratio changing when you're watching the movie, the 1.371 automatically just feels kind of older. So it just puts you in that mindset when you're watching it of being like, um, yeah, this is the oldest part of the film, oldest setting, I guess. The Lighthouse here, this movie was shot almost 1 to 1. Um, so it's very square, and it definitely gives it a very vintage feel. And if you've seen the movie, you know that that would very much be on purpose. Um, yeah, it's shot on vintage lenses. I can't remember how old they are, but they're from like the 30s or 40s. They're very old lenses. It's black and white. It's shot on film. It's in an almost 1 to 1 square aspect ratio. Um, it's actually the aspect ratio that was used when before sync sound, or just an example of non-sync sound. So it's not exactly square because they left a little bit of room on the film strip to record audio. So it's major film geeky knowledge, but it will sort of give that look of really early cinema, um, when sound was recorded onto film, when picture and sound was recorded onto film. It also just affects the aesthetics. So, like for example, the cinematographers are going to use aspect ratio to their advantage and frame things, and the production design is also going to take it into consideration. So you get these really, like in this shot, for example, really cool, like spiral from the staircase, and then those chains dangling down. And if you can imagine this shot on a more wide aspect ratio, this would look entirely different, and you would actually lose part of the staircase there. So you wouldn't really have that, like, kind of spiraling, beautiful, symmetrical golden ratio sort of thing happening. Pretty contemporary example here is Saltburn, and this was shot on 4:3. So you may have noticed when you saw it, because it's a pretty unconventional choice. So 4:3, it's not exactly square, but it's pretty close. And um, I actually don't really know why it was shot in 4:3. I feel like it didn't really serve the story, to be honest, but maybe there's something I don't know. But either way, it was an unconventional choice, and it was definitely something that a lot of people talked about and noticed, because unless you have watched many older movies, maybe it feels a little bit different or strange. But even if you have, I think it still feels different and isn't strange, just because it's a very contemporary movie that's not even trying to take place like 50 years ago or something, or 70 years ago. Um, so here's some terminology. Letterboxing is the black bars on the top and bottom. That's what you typically see with anything that's going to be a bit wider. So make sure your TV is not on fit to screen, otherwise you're not going to have letterboxing, and it's actually going to stretch the image, so it won't be viewed in the aspect ratio that the filmmakers intended, and things will look, like a funhouse mirror. You may not even notice, honestly, until you change it, which I've been to people's houses before, and change their settings for them, and then they're like, "Oh my gosh, wow, this looks so much better." Um, so that is a setting you can put on your TV, but yeah, by default it should be off. But something to check. So yeah, if you just look at the letterboxing, you can have an idea of what the aspect ratio is immediately. Pillar boxing, if you're watching a film such as The Lighthouse or Saltburn, you're going to see pillar boxing. So you're just going to see black bars on the sides, and that is the result of a more square aspect ratio. Window boxing is not very common. It's a unique choice for sure. I think that usually when you see this happen, it's not going to be for the whole movie. It will just be for like certain scenes or shots, for some kind of creative choice. So yeah, that's just what it is. I don't see it very often at all, but when you see it now, you'll know that it's called window boxing. Here's a video I want you to check out. I've learned actually that a lot of people don't know that you can film, in different aspect ratios on your phone. This is instructions on how to do it on an iPhone. It's a little bit tricky, and it's not actually very intuitive, because you can change your aspect ratio in photo mode on your phone. You might already know this, but you'll notice that when you go to video mode on your phone, you don't have the menu options to change your aspect ratio. So, but you can record video in different aspect ratios on your phone. It's just there's a little bit of like a hack to it. It's fairly simple, but I always find it interesting, because whenever I teach this class, I mean in person at least, I find that most people don't know that you can do this. So it's pretty fun to do. If you have a different phone, such as a Samsung and whatnot, from what I've witnessed, it's a bit easier. It's not really like a trick. You just select it and you can film. So for those of you who do have iPhones, though, it's a little more complicated. So check out that video, and you might be like, "Wow, I can't believe I never knew that." Okay, so here is your assignment. It says part one because next week we're actually going to talk a little bit more about aspect ratio. Um, and so here's part one. So first of all, make sure you learn how to change your aspect ratio on your phone. If you don't own a phone, then borrow one. If you have like a brick phone or a flip phone or some version that doesn't have this as an option, then you will just you will need to track one down. It should not be hard to find somebody um, who has a Samsung or a Galaxy or an iPhone. Find a partner, friend, family member, whatever, and I want you to record them doing something very simple and repeatable. So make it super, super simple, honestly. Like it could just be them saying a sentence and then sitting down, or putting chapstick on, or sharpening their pencil. Um, Really anything. Like make it really, really simple. The reason why is because you want to make sure that they can do it um, over and over again exactly the same way. So, seasoned actors are very good at doing this because they do entire scenes over and over the exact same way, know exactly, when they sipped the water and said the line, and when they stood up, and when they walked away, and when they adjusted their tie, and things like that. But, um, I want you to just find something super, super simple. All right. You're going to record the performance 3 times. And then each time, I want you to record it using a different aspect ratio. So, and keep the shot the same, meaning don't move the camera further or closer from your subject. Just keep your feet where they are, keep the subject where they are, and just film them doing the thing um, in 3 different aspect ratios. And it's up to you. It can be 1:1, 4:3, 16:9. If you have an iPhone, those are going to be your options. If you have another phone, you might have some more options. Oh, actually, you'll also have 9:16 if you just turn your phone. So choose 3 of those. All right, you can do more if you want, of course, but the assignment is to do 3 minimum. And the point is, I want you to explore how the aspect ratio affects your recording. So even for something this small, when you record it, you're going to notice that it affects the framing of your subject. So, for example, you might have been forced to move the camera or wanting to move your camera because the framing is going to totally change. Or if they're moving, you might need to move the camera, or you may not need to move the camera, right? If you have a pretty wide aspect ratio on. So think about what changed within the frame. What could we see more of or less of? Um, how did it affect the camera placement? Did it force you to move? Did it make you want to move? I'm going to say don't move, right? So you can really see, like, even if their head's cut off or something. Um, and then also just think about how it affects the aesthetics and the emotional impact of the recording. So even if it's something so simple as, um, they're sitting down and reading a text off their phone, you might notice that depending on the aspect ratio, it's going to tell a different story, right? So if you have a really wide aspect ratio and they're placed in the center, your character is likely to look really lonely, right? Because there's all this empty space around them. If it's more square and they're kind of filling up the whole frame, it might feel a little bit more claustrophobic or maybe a little bit more intimate. Um, do they look more confident? Do they look more shy, calm, detached, lively, etc.? Right. Also, does it look more modern or does it look more vintage? More square aspect ratios, like these Wes Anderson movies, they look very quaint, kind of like cute, right? Early Instagram sort of aesthetic, early film aesthetic. So it might, the square one might look that way to you. It may not, right? Um, If it's more wide, it might look more contemporary. It also might look more epic or dramatic, for example, more, I don't know, cinematic even. So think about that, and and then lastly, decide which aspect ratio do you think is best for this recording, for this performance or whatever it is that you captured. And this is really important because, for those of you who might go on to make films or are making films, this is one of the very first choices that you need to make when you are deciding to make a movie, because it's going to affect so many things. And I think every movie like, there's no correct or best, sorry, there's no like best aspect ratio. There's just kind of the best one to tell the story, or the best one just for that film. So cinematographers and directors will consider several aspect ratios and kind of experiment, do some screen testing, do some location scouting, do things like that with different aspect ratios, and then determine which aspect ratio is going to be the best choice for this movie. And then once you've made that decision, you're pretty much locked in to that aspect ratio. And it's going to be very difficult to change it, if to change your mind along the way, because the production design and storyboards, all of these things are going to kind of get derailed. Um, so I hope that you enjoy this activity. And then I also just hope that as you watch the movies in this class and just other things on your own time, that you're just paying attention to the aspect ratio, and thinking about why the filmmakers made that choice. All right, that is it. And I look forward to next week. See you then. Bye.